Okay, so in the first half of the epilogue of Atonement, Bryony reveals that she's suffering from vascular dementia and is slowly sort of losing her memory, and she also starts making the journey to return to the Tallis home to watch what ends up being the new version of the Trials of Arabella. A few things that I think are worth referring to here. She makes reference to the fact that she visited the Imperial War Museum, and she says that used to be Bedlam, in other words, the hospital for mentally ill people. And she makes the joke that basically it used to be a hospital for the mentally ill, and now it's a place to study the collective insanity of war. It's about 8 lines down. But I think that line, the collective insanity of war, is important because I think what it reminds us is that link between AO2 and 3 again. At the time of war, due to the insanity, due to the craziness, due to the fact that the normal rules don't apply, how can Bryony be expected to get any sort of atonement? Because good and bad and right and wrong go completely out the window. And it's that idea that she commits the crime, but it's compounded by the war that kills Cecilia and Robbie. And we see at the bottom of page 353, as Bryony says, I've always liked to make a tidy finish, we see her reasons for giving us this fake ending. She wants things to be neat, she wants things to be tied off. However, she also knows that in the reality, at this time of war, that can't be done. So the only way she can do it is to produce a story where the reader sort of suspends their disbelief and accepts that the story that they want is what is allowed to happen. And that balance between reality and fiction is blurred again on page 354. There's a description of Bryony's vascular dementia, and a couple of the details don't quite add up. Now again, McEwan tends to research his books quite extensively, so it's tempting to argue that this could be a deliberate thing. And you could almost argue that what McEwan is doing is he's not making it too easy. He doesn't want us to go, oh, the reality is that Bryony's, losing her mind and that Robbie and Cecilia died and the fiction is this. He wants that line to be blurred, just like in the reference to the Grey's Anatomy page. It's not as simple as that, because the whole thing is a novel, and therefore it's sort of an agreement between reader and writer and narrator of what we want the sort of facts and the truth to be. On page 355, Bryony's in the taxi on this way home. There's a reference about 2/3 of the way down that they're going through Bloomsbury, past the house where my father lived after his second marriage. So we see that nuclear family disintegrated there. From Emily Tallis ignoring her husband's affair because she wanted to keep this family together, we realise that must have ended up being destroyed, that family, and her father had another life with another woman. Okay, so the world is changing. That nuclear family has disintegrated. 355, 3 lines from the bottom, we're told we crossed the river at Waterloo Bridge, so again she's going back to childhood, back to this innocence, back to the Trials of Arabella, and she crosses a bridge to do so. So we get the feeling that the world has changed. However, on page 357 she sees Lola and Paul Marshall, and just before the halfway point of page 357 we're told that he's now called Lord Marshall. So even though the world has changed and moved on, Paul Marshall, just like offering the police the cigarettes from the gold case, now he's a lord, he's still got that institutionalised power due to his class and his wealth. Bottom of page 357, Bryony thinks about this and says it's often been remarked upon how much good he did in the world. Perhaps he spent a lifetime making amends. And we get that idea that this guilt is something that follows him just like it's followed Bryony. But as we go on to page 358, she's very clear to make reference to the fact that she gets her atonement through the novel, and by doing that she casts Lola and Paul Marshall very much as the villains. And as page 358 goes on, it's almost like a parody version of what she does in part 1, when she decides Robbie must be this evil maniac. She does the same thing in relation to Lola and Paul Marshall. About 1/3 of the way down the page we're told that she was taller than her husband now. So Lola again is this contradictory figure. On the one hand, she is this innocent child who was raped and had her innocence stolen. On the other hand, she's now in control of the relationship. She's the one pulling the strings. It's not as simple that she's simply a victim. She has kept the truth hidden as well. And we're told that she's got, clownish makeup, it's over the top. But Bryony says halfway down the page, I've always been a Puritan, so I count myself an unreliable witness. Deliberately legal language, unreliable witness in it. Deliberate reference to part 1. In part 3, when Bryony goes to see Robbie and Cecilia and she says, I'll change my story, they say it won't matter, you're an unreliable witness. We get that line again coming back, okay? Bryony's referring to the fact that she was an unreliable witness with Robbie because she cast him as a villain, and now she's sort of nodding to the reader saying, and I'm doing it again with Lola, I'm seeing her as a villain. But we're kind of in on the joke here. We want Lola to be the villain, we want Paul Marshall to be the villain. So we accept that in the story we do sort of meet each other halfway. Okay, she is exaggerating, she's knowingly exaggerating how bad they are, but in the story that's what we want. We want Robbie and Cecilia rewarded and the bad people punished. She carries on that she looks like a stage villain, the gaunt figure, the black coat, the lurid lips. She says she's almost like Cruella de Vil. And again, there's that reference that she's almost like these gothic villains. It's that reference back to Northanger Abbey. Bryony's exaggerating this. Bryony's, relating it to other villains from film, Cruella de Vil, or literary references. But she's doing it knowingly. She's saying, yeah, but I know what I'm doing here. I'm wearing on it. On page 359, about a third of the way down, there's a reference to Mr. Nettle. Remember, Robbie was at war with Nettle, and basically Nettle has written to Bryony and told her and helped to fill in the gaps for part 2 of what happened to Robbie. I think it's interesting with his name being Nettle that in part 1 she cut down all these Nettles, and she cut down Robbie and she cut down Cecilia, just like she does sort of at the end when she reveals that they're dead. But through Nettle she's built them back up again, hasn't she? So Nettles have brought them down and the Nettle has built them up. Through him, she's actually allowed Robbie to live on and allowed Cecilia to live on. When we get on to page 360, about 2/3 of the way down, Bryony says, if I really cared so much about facts, I should have written a different kind of book, but my work was done, there would be no further drafts. So again, that reference is not as simple as sort of reality and fiction. In a story, it's always going to be a fiction. We always sort of meet in the middle, and she's giving the reader here what we want. She's giving us this return to childhood innocence, and we know that it's a lie, but we want to accept it because we want the story to be true, and we want Lola and Paul Marshall punished. We're told at the bottom of page 360 that Bryony had a husband called Thierry. So she has this French husband. I think that could be a reference back to Luc Cornet. Remember that young French soldier who Bryony told that she loved. And there's that idea that she's got that redemption through returning to childhood, through telling him a lie that was done for the right reasons. And I think with that French husband, there's that idea that there is a sense of atonement there. When we get onto page 362, she reflects on the taxi driver, and it turns out that this guy driving a taxi is actually studying law at university. And Bryony makes the point halfway down that it's quite impossible these days to assume anything about people's educational level from the way they talk or dress or their taste in music. So in the way that Robbie was judged, because they reflect that, Robbie was always sort of looked down on, and Emily Tallis was never happy that he did better than Cecilia at uni. There's that idea that here the world has changed, that things have flipped round, that the world's a different place. On page 363, about a quarter of the way down, there's a reference to Emily's funeral. Bryony says she came to the house for Emily's funeral. So she's still calling her Emily, still referring to her by her first name, shows that lack of motherly authority. But also, she's dead, she's out of the way, she's gone. And I think that's key, isn't it? Just like Mrs. Gradgrind, this mother figure just ends up anonymously disappearing. She's not even referred to as my mother.